The city burns before surrender is even offered. Smoke rises from towers that still stand. Bodies line roads leading to gates that remain closed. The defenders watch from the walls, their hands trembling on their weapons, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the Mongol army waits in perfect silence. They have not attacked. They have not moved. They simply let the refugees speak. This is not war as conquest. This is war as psychological demolition. The Mongols understood something that empires, with larger armies and greater wealth, did not, that the human mind breaks long before the body. That terror, properly administered, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. That rumor travels faster than cavalry, and fear spreads wider than fire. Between 1206 and 1368, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, not through superior numbers, but through the systematic destruction of their enemies' will to resist. They conquered over 24 million square kilometers. They shattered kingdoms from Korea to Hungary, from Persia to Russia. They broke empires that had stood for centuries. But they did not do this with strength alone. They did this by mastering the darkest art of warfare, the deliberate, calculated annihilation of hope. This is how the Mongols used psychological warfare to break empires. Genghis Khan understood a fundamental truth that most conquerors miss. An enemy who surrenders immediately costs nothing. An enemy who resists once and is crushed becomes a lesson. An enemy who resists twice must cease to exist, not just as an army, but as a memory, a culture, a warning carved into history so deeply that no one dares follow their example. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was engineering. The Mongol military doctrine was built on a simple calculation: make resistance so catastrophically costly that surrender becomes the only rational choice. Make the first act of defiance the last mistake a city ever makes. Make the punishment so total, so visible, so horrifying, that every other city hears about it and opens their gates without a fight. In 1219, the Khwarezmian Empire controlled a vast territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to Afghanistan. Its Shah, Muhammad II, ruled over prosperous cities, trained armies, fortified walls. He had wealth, power, military strength, and he made one mistake. He executed Mongol ambassadors. Genghis Khan's response was not immediate rage. It was methodical erasure. He gathered intelligence for months. He studied trade routes, water sources, political fractures, tribal tensions. He identified which cities were loyal to the Shah, which were resentful, which could be turned. Then he moved. The Mongol army divided into multiple columns, each targeting a different city simultaneously. This created a psychological problem for the defenders. They could not coordinate. They could not send reinforcements. They could not know if help was coming or if they stood alone. Isolation breeds panic. The first cities that resisted were destroyed with clinical precision. The Mongols did not merely kill the defenders. They executed the entire population, soldiers, civilians, children, and then demolished the walls, burned the fields, diverted the rivers. They turned thriving urban centers into open graves. But here's the crucial detail. They let witnesses escape. Survivors were not accidents. They were weapons. The Mongols deliberately spared small groups of refugees, sending them, fleeing toward the next city with stories of what they had seen. These survivors carried the most potent weapon in the Mongol arsenal: testimony. They described streets choked with bodies. They described pyramids of skulls stacked outside the ruins. They described Mongol discipline, their silence, their efficiency. They described the moment the arrows fell like black rain, the moment the walls crumbled, the moment hope died, and when those refugees arrived at the next city, exhausted and traumatized, their words did what no siege engine could. They broke morale before the battle even began. The Mongols did not just kill, they staged horror. After the fall of Urgench in 1221, the Mongol forces faced a practical problem. The city had resisted fiercely, and its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Executing them all would take time, and time was a resource even the Mongols managed carefully, so they turned execution into spectacle. Mongol commanders organized the massacre with bureaucratic efficiency. The population was divided into groups. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota, between 100 and 300 people. The executions took place in open fields outside the city, visible from the surrounding region. This was not hidden. This was advertised. The Mongols wanted witnesses. They wanted travelers, merchants, shepherds, scouts from other cities to see the aftermath. They wanted the message to spread, not through official declarations, but through whispered horror in marketplaces, through traders who saw the fields and rode to the next city with the story. Fear transmitted through unofficial channels is more believable than propaganda. A survivor's trembling voice carries more weight than a proclamation. The Mongols understood the psychology of testimony, that people trust what they see, or what someone they know has seen. But physical horror was only one layer. The Mongols also mastered symbolic terror. At Nishapur in 1221, after the city killed a Mongol general in battle, the execution method was specifically chosen for psychological impact. The Mongols reportedly constructed pyramids from the severed heads of the victims, separate pyramids for men, women, and children. Whether this account is entirely accurate or partially legendary is less important than its effect. The story spread. It became part of the Mongol reputation. It fused with reality until the line between fact and fear blurred into a single, paralyzing truth. Resistance meant annihilation not just of you, but of your legacy, your family line, your city's name. The Mongols built their reputation on consistency. When they made a promise, they kept it. If a city surrendered, it was usually spared, sometimes even integrated with favorable terms. If it resisted and fell, the destruction was total. This binary choice became a trap. Surrender meant life, but humiliation and subjugation. Resistance meant death, but honor. Most leaders chose honor. Most populations paid the price. And every leader in every city that came after heard what happened and faced the same choice, knowing now what honor actually cost. The Mongols did not need to destroy every city. They only needed to destroy enough to make the threat real. After that, the fear did the work. Before the Mongol army appeared on the horizon, they were already inside the city. Genghis Khan built one of history's most sophisticated intelligence networks, decades before most empires. Understood the concept of organized espionage. He deployed merchants, diplomats, defectors, and scouts across Asia, gathering information on terrain, politics, military strength, food supplies, leadership personalities, and internal conflicts. This was not random. This was systematic infiltration. Mongol intelligence operatives posed as traders traveling the Silk Road. They mapped cities, noted the thickness of walls, observed troop movements, identified water sources. They listened in marketplaces for rumors of political instability, succession disputes, religious tensions. They offered gifts to local officials, building relationships that could later be exploited. When the Mongol army finally moved, it did so with near-perfect information. They knew where the grain stores were. They knew which gates were weakest. They knew which nobles resented their king. They knew when harvests had failed and supplies were low. They knew the psychology of the city's leadership, whether they were brave or cautious, proud or pragmatic. This intelligence advantage created a profound psychological effect. Cities under Mongol siege often felt as if the enemy could see through walls. How did the Mongols know exactly where the food supplies were stored? How did they know which nobleman could be bribed? How did they know the precise location of the weakest structural point in the defenses? This sense of omniscience was deliberately cultivated. The Mongols wanted their enemies to feel exposed, vulnerable, as if resistance was futile because the enemy already knew every secret, every plan, every weakness. But intelligence gathering served another purpose: psychological fracture. The Mongols routinely exploited internal divisions. In China, they allied with the Song dynasty against the Jin dynasty, letting their enemies destroy each other. In Russia, they played rival princes against one another, supporting one prince's claim to power in exchange for loyalty, then using that prince as a puppet to control the others. They identified cities within empires that felt overtaxed, underrepresented, or resentful of central authority. They offered those cities better terms if they surrendered early, or even if they betrayed their own empire. This turned empires into networks of potential traitors, where loyalty became suspect and paranoia spread through the command structure. An empire that cannot trust itself cannot defend itself. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies. They dissolved the social cohesion that held civilizations together. They made allies into enemies, soldiers into deserters, cities into isolated fortresses waiting their turn to die. and they did this before the first arrow was ever fired. The Mongol army appears at dawn. The defenders stand on the walls, counting. 10,000 perhaps. 20,000. It's difficult to tell with cavalry spread across the plains, moving in coordinated patterns, their formation shifting like water. Then the messengers arrive. Not soldiers, diplomats. They ride under banners of truce, unarmed, respectful. They ask to speak with the city's rulers. The message they deliver is calm, almost administrative. Surrender now, and you will be spared. Your leaders may retain their positions. Your people will be taxed, but not harmed. Trade will continue. Life will continue. Resist, and you will be destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Your walls will be leveled. Your population will be executed. Your city will become a cautionary tale whispered in distant lands. This offer is made publicly, in front of the city's population. The diplomats ensure that everyone, not just the leaders, but the merchants, the families, the farmers who fled inside the walls, hears the terms. This creates internal pressure. The leaders may want to resist, to preserve their honor, their sovereignty, but the population begins to question, is pride worth annihilation? The merchants think of their warehouses. The farmers think of their children. Doubt spreads. And if the city refuses, the Mongols employ their next tactic. They wait. The siege begins not with assault, but with encirclement. The Mongols cut off supply routes, then withdraw slightly, creating a perimeter, but not engaging. They set up camps, settle in, begin their routines, cooking, training, maintaining equipment, as if they have all the time in the world. Because they do. This patience is psychological warfare. Inside the city, supplies begin to dwindle. Days turn into weeks. The initial resolve hardens into anxiety, then desperation. The defenders watch the Mongol camps, seeing the smoke from their fires, hearing the distant sounds of their life continuing normally while the city slowly starves. But the Mongols are not idle. They construct siege weapons in full view of the defenders. Enormous trebuchets, siege towers, battering rams. They do this slowly, methodically, letting the defenders watch each piece being assembled, each test shot calibrated. The psychological impact is cumulative, anticipation mixed with dread, and then sometimes they send envoys again. The offer is repeated, but the terms are worse. Surrender now and only the leaders will be executed. The population will be enslaved but alive. This is communicated as mercy, a degraded mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Inside the city, factions form. Some argue for continued resistance. Others advocate surrender. The social fabric begins to tear. Accusations of cowardice and treason fly. In council chambers, the defenders are fighting two wars, one against the enemy outside, one against the collapse of unity inside. The Mongols do not need to break the walls, they only need to break the will. When the assault finally comes, it is often against a city already psychologically defeated. The defenders are exhausted, demoralized, divided. The Mongols strike with overwhelming force, and the collapse is rapid. But even here the psychology continues. After the fall, the Mongols sometimes spare one neighborhood, a single district where families are allowed to live, where property is protected, where life continues almost normally. This is showcased. Survivors from this district are allowed to travel, to spread the story that surrender brings mercy. Other districts are annihilated. The contrast is deliberate. It creates a clear equation in every future city the Mongols approach. Surrender equals survival. Resistance equals extinction. The choice is binary, and the evidence, is testimonial, visible, undeniable. The Mongols mastered the art of deception on a scale that transformed perception into strategic advantage. During campaigns in Eastern Europe, Mongol commanders routinely inflated their numbers through elaborate illusions. They tied branches to horses' tails, dragging them across the plains to raise enormous dust clouds that suggested vast armies on the march. They lit extra campfires at night, spreading them across miles of terrain to create the impression of forces 3 or 4 times their actual size. They dressed prisoners in Mongol armor and placed them on horses in distant formations, creating phantom battalions that existed only as silhouettes against the sky. They spread their actual forces thin across wide fronts, making multiple appearances in different locations within days, creating the impossible impression of being everywhere simultaneously. This was not just battlefield trickery. This was reality manipulation. Scouts returning to their cities reported Mongol numbers in the hundreds of thousands, when the actual force might be 60 or 70,000. But the reports were not technically lies. The scouts reported what they saw: dust clouds, campfires, formations. They reported their perception, and perception became the accepted truth. European chroniclers wrote of Mongol hordes numbering in the millions, an impossible exaggeration, but one that shaped political and military decisions for decades. Cities prepared for apocalyptic invasions. Kingdoms diverted resources to defensive fortifications against an enemy whose actual numbers were far smaller than imagined. The Mongols won battles before they arrived simply by controlling what their enemies believed about them. But deception worked in another direction as well: feigned weakness. The Mongol tactical doctrine included the feigned retreat, a maneuver they refined to psychological perfection. In battle, Mongol cavalry would engage briefly, then suddenly withdraw, appearing to flee in disarray. Pursuing enemies, sensing victory, would break formation to chase them. Then the trap closed. The retreating Mongols would wheel around or lead the pursuers into ambush positions where fresh Mongol forces waited. The psychological impact was devastating. The moment of triumph converted instantly into catastrophe. Soldiers who believed they were winning suddenly found themselves surrounded, their formations broken, their commanders isolated. This tactic defeated the Khwarezmian army, the Hungarian forces at Mohi, the Russian princes at the Kalka River. Each time the pattern repeated, perceived weakness transformed into sudden, overwhelming strength. The emotional whiplash from victory to annihilation shattered morale more completely than straightforward defeat ever could. The soldiers who survived these engagements carried trauma that spread. They spoke of Mongol trickery, Mongol cunning, the impossibility of knowing when retreat was real or feigned, when victory was genuine or illusion. This uncertainty infected future battles. Every engagement against Mongols became psychologically fraught, every tactical decision shadowed by doubt. Even Mongol camp layouts were designed for psychological effect. When establishing siege positions, they built their camps with mathematical precision: neat rows, organized supply lines, clear command structures visible from the walls of besieged cities. This communicated discipline, professionalism, and army that functioned like a machine. The defenders, watching this, understood implicitly that they faced not barbarians, but organized military force, not chaos, but lethal efficiency. The visual message reinforced the reputation, and the reputation reinforced the fear. Genghis Khan's rise to power was built on psychological insight into human nature, specifically into loyalty, status, and belonging. He was born to Mujin, into a world of fractious Mongol tribes where loyalty was transactional, where alliances shifted with opportunity, where betrayal was common and strength was temporary. His father was poisoned. His family was abandoned by their tribe. He experienced firsthand the fragility of tribal bonds, and from this he built a system that transcended tribe entirely. Genghis Khan reorganized Mongol society around units of 10, Arbans, Zuns, Mingens, Tumens, military structures based not on tribal affiliation, but on assigned position. A soldier's loyalty was to his unit, to his commander, to the system, not to his birth tribe. This was revolutionary. It shattered the traditional power of tribal chiefs, replacing blood loyalty with structured hierarchy. It created a new identity, Mongol, that superseded tribal divisions. It made the army itself the tribe, unified under a single code of law, the Yasa, which applied equally to everyone regardless of birth status. Genghis Khan promoted based on merit, not lineage. A shepherd could become a general if he demonstrated skill. A captured enemy who proved capable could be integrated into the Mongol command structure. This created a psychological effect. Loyalty was rewarded, competence was valued, and every soldier understood that their advancement depended on performance, not politics. But this system also weaponized loyalty through brutal enforcement. Desertion was punished by death, not just of the deserter, but of his entire unit of 10. If one man fled, 9 others died. This created mutual surveillance, peer pressure, enforced by survival instinct. Every soldier was both watched and watcher, accountable not just to his commanders but to his comrades. Cowardice in battle was similarly punished collectively. If one unit retreated without orders, the entire unit faced execution. This removed individual discretion. There was no choice but to fight, because retreat was death either from the enemy or from your own army. This system produced soldiers who fought with desperate intensity, not from personal courage, but from structural impossibility of doing anything else. Fear of the Mongols' enemies was balanced against certainty of punishment from Mongol command. The rational choice was always forward. Genghis Khan also understood the psychology of inclusion. When conquering new territories, he often integrated defeated enemies directly into his own forces. Captured engineers were put to work building siege weapons. Captured administrators were given roles managing conquered provinces. Captured soldiers were retrained and absorbed into Mongol tumans. This served multiple purposes. It expanded the Mongol military without depleting the Mongol population. It demonstrated that loyalty to the system was rewarded regardless of origin. It turned potential resistance leaders into stakeholders in Mongol success, and it demoralized remaining resistance by showing their own people fighting under Mongol banners. The psychological message was clear. The Mongols were not conquerors who replaced. They were a system that absorbed. Resistance was futile not because you couldn't win battles, but because even victory would eventually become assimilation. The empire did not demand cultural conversion. It demanded obedience. You could keep your religion, your language, your customs, so long as you paid tribute, provided soldiers when demanded, and accepted Mongol authority. This pragmatic tolerance was itself psychological strategy. It made resistance seem irrational. Why die for sovereignty when you could live with autonomy? Why fight for independence when independence itself was negotiable? Many chose not to fight, and those who did found themselves facing not just an army, but a system that turned their own people against them, a machine that absorbed defectors, rewarded collaboration, and punished resistance with mechanical consistency. The Mongols did not just conquer territories. They conquered the concept of loyalty itself, redefining it as allegiance not to birthplace or tribe, but to the empire, the law, the Khan. When the Jin dynasty fell in 1234, it was not because the Mongols defeated them militarily. It was because the Jin dynasty defeated itself. The Mongols had invaded northern China in 1211, beginning a war that would last decades. But the Mongols did not simply besiege cities and fight battles. They employed a strategy of systematic exhaustion, striking, withdrawing, returning, creating a state of permanent crisis that drained Jin resources, morale, and political cohesion. The Jin government raised taxes to fund the war. The population, already suffering from Mongol raids, grew resentful. Local administrators, tasked with impossible quotas, became corrupt or incompetent. Soldiers, underpaid and poorly supplied, deserted or defected. The central government issued increasingly desperate edicts that local officials ignored. The Mongols did not need to destroy the Jin dynasty. They simply needed to pressure it until it collapsed under its own dysfunction. This pattern repeated across continents. The Khwarezmian Empire dissolved not from battlefield losses alone, but from political fragmentation. The Shah fled, abandoning his cities. His commanders lost faith. His provinces declared independence or surrendered separately to the Mongols, each making their own deals. The Mongols exploited this relentlessly. They offered individual cities better terms if they surrendered before their neighbors. This created a race to capitulation. Each city knew that. If they held out while others surrendered, they would be isolated and face total destruction. But if they surrendered first, they might secure mercy. This destroyed collective defense. Empires require coordination. They require cities to support each other, provinces to send reinforcements, populations to endure hardship for a collective cause. The Mongols shattered this coordination by making defection rational, by making loyalty suicidal. In Russia, the Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1240 did not conquer through military superiority alone. The Russian principalities were divided, competitive, often hostile to each other. The Mongols exploited these divisions, negotiating with some princes while destroying others, creating examples and exceptions. Prince Yaroslav of Vladimir cooperated and was confirmed as Grand Prince under Mongol suzerainty. His rivals were executed. The lesson was clear: collaborate and prosper, resist and die. Future Russian politics became a contest not of who could resist the Mongols, but of who could gain Mongol favor. This was domination through psychological reorientation. The Mongols did not need to occupy Russia with massive armies. They needed only to embed themselves into the political structure, to make Mongol approval the key to Russian power. The princes enforced Mongol policy themselves, competed for Mongol support, paid tribute without requiring Mongol soldiers to collect it. The empire became self-enforcing, but the deepest psychological impact was cultural memory. Generations grew up knowing the Mongol reputation, knowing the stories of cities destroyed, armies annihilated, empires erased. This collective memory shaped decisions long after the actual Mongol threat diminished. Cities surrendered to Mongol forces that were actually small, exhausted, far from reinforcement, because they believed the reputation, feared the consequences, and chose survival over uncertain resistance. The psychology outlived the material reality. Even today, the Mongol conquests remain cultural trauma in many regions. The term Mongol horde entered languages as synonym for unstoppable barbaric force. The massacres became historical touchstones. The speed of the conquest, the scale of destruction, the psychological sophistication of the tactics, all of it fused into a legend that transcended the actual historical facts. The Mongols broke empires not just physically, but psychologically, so thoroughly that the memory of their breaking became part of the cultural identity of the conquered, a wound that shaped future decisions, a fear embedded in historical consciousness. The Mongol Empire was not built on horses and bows. It was built on understanding, cold, precise understanding of how human beings think, fear, decide, and break. Genghis Khan and his successors mastered psychological warfare not as supplementary tactic but as primary strategy. They recognized that the mind surrenders before the body, that reputation can be weaponized, that fear properly administered becomes a force multiplier more powerful than any number of soldiers. They understood that war is fundamentally a contest of wills, not just of strength. That victory belongs not to the side that can inflict the most damage, but to the side that can endure, that can make the enemy believe continuation is pointless, that can destroy hope itself. The Mongols perfected the formula. Make the cost of resistance catastrophic. Make surrender appear rational. Make your power seem infinite. Make collaboration feel inevitable. They turned cities into examples, populations into messengers, empires into self-destructing organisms. They built an intelligence network that made them omniscient, a reputation that made them unstoppable, a military system that made defeat impossible to their own soldiers. They did not conquer the world through brutality alone. They conquered it through engineering of perception, reputation, fear, loyalty, and collapse. The siege weapons were real, the armies were real, the battles were real, but the decisive battlefield was always psychological. The moment when a city's council decided surrender was preferable to annihilation. The moment when an empire's commanders realized resistance only delayed inevitable destruction. The moment when soldiers chose obedience over desertion because the system made all alternatives fatal. This is the dark lesson of the Mongol conquests. That terror, properly structured, becomes infrastructure. That fear, systematically applied, becomes governance. That psychological warfare, executed with precision, achieves what conventional military force cannot, not just the defeat of enemies, but the elimination of the will to resist. The Mongols conquered the largest land empire in history because they understood something fundamental about human nature, that we are, all of us, more vulnerable in our minds than in our bodies, more defeatable in our beliefs than in our strength, more easily broken by what we fear than by what we face. And they weaponized that knowledge with ruthless, brilliant, terrifying efficiency. The towers fell, the walls crumbled, the empires collapsed. But the first conquest was always internal, the moment when hope died, when resistance seemed futile, when survival required surrender. That was when the Mongols truly won, not on the battlefield, but in the space between thought and action, between fear and decision, between what was and what could never be again.